Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
They said I was too embarrassing to bring to the fundraiser. Not in those exact words, of course. Claire's never been that direct, but I heard it. I heard it with my own ears, from the hallway outside her kitchen, while I was dropping off a baby shower gift for her friend whose name I never remembered, but whose registry my sister forwarded to me like it was my duty to fund. The voice I heard was hers, polished, sugary smooth, just like always, but the words were like knives. No, I just don't think it's a good idea to bring her. She's awkward. Last time she told some joke about Elon Musk and toothpaste or something. It was painful. Then laughter. Her husband Ben's. That wheezy, country club chuckle he always did when he was trying to impress someone richer than him. Yeah, it'd be a little off-brand, he said. Off-brand. As if I was a knockoff purse. I left the gift on the porch and drove away without knocking. I didn't even cry. Not then, anyway. It was a strange, almost scientific kind of numbness that took over. Like my body went on autopilot, and my brain just started playing back a highlight reel of every moment they made me feel small. And trust me, the tape was long. Claire and Ben had this habit, not just of mocking me behind my back, but of doing it in ways that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I deserved it. That's the real art of it. The dig is never obvious. It's a compliment with a splinter under the skin. You're so brave to wear that color, or it's great that you're finally sticking to something. I used to think I was imagining it. I'm not anymore. That night, the night of the gala, I didn't even try to pretend I had plans. I could have lied, sure. Could have put on some makeup, posted an old photo from a brunch 2 years ago, captioned it like I was out living a glamorous, exciting life. But what would be the point? The truth was simple. I sat alone in a booth at Joey's Diner off Route 17, ate my grilled cheese sandwich with fries, and watched the rain hit the window like a slow, personal metronome. Across from me sat no one. Just a leather-bound notebook and a mug of lukewarm coffee. I opened my phone and saw Claire's Instagram story. There she was, laughing under strings of white lights, holding a flute of champagne next to Ben, both of them with those perfect plastic grins, surrounded by old money and fresh Botox. The caption said, "So honored to support future leaders at tonight's fundraiser." No tag. No mention. Nothing. You wouldn't even know she had a sister. I stared at that photo longer than I care to admit. Not because I envied her, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something in me had been permanently moved. Like a chess piece that could never go back to its square. I wasn't angry in the usual way. I didn't want to call her and demand an apology. I didn't want to post some vague status about fake people. What I wanted was to disappear from her world completely and build something so undeniable that even her curated silence couldn't drown it out. It was right there in that booth, under the buzzing fluorescence of a 24-hour diner with bad coffee and worse service, that I opened the Notes app on my phone and wrote a single sentence: never again. That was all. Not a business plan. Not a speech. Just those 2 words. But it was a beginning. It was the first time I didn't feel like I had to ask anyone for a seat at their table. You know, sometimes people ask me when I knew I had it in me. When I realized I could build something real, something big. They think it must have been when I got my first investor meeting, or when I landed my patent, or maybe when I was asked to speak on a panel in San Francisco next to founders with MBAs from places I couldn't even afford to tour. But the truth is, it wasn't any of those moments. It was right there in Joey's Diner, alone, phone in hand, with nothing but silence and humiliation in my throat. That was the moment. Because once you've been humiliated by people who are supposed to love you, once you felt that burn of being called too embarrassing by your own flesh and blood, you stop fearing failure. You stop fearing rejection. You stop fearing anything that isn't total annihilation, because you've already tasted it. Claire didn't call that night. Neither did Ben. No apology. No text to ask if I was doing okay. I wasn't surprised. They were too busy being admired. I wasn't in the picture, so I didn't exist. I went home, microwaved leftover chicken tikka, and watched a documentary about sea urchins. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up sketching an idea that had been sitting in the back of my head for months, a design for a predictive logic circuit that could adapt in real time to user patterns. At the time, I didn't even know how I'd build it. I didn't have the tools, the team, or even a computer that didn't overheat when I opened more than 3 tabs. But I had the idea. And more importantly, I had the fury. The next morning, I got up at 6, took out my tiny recycling bin of resumes, and threw them in the trash. I made a new one. A bold one. I didn't lie, but I didn't downplay anything either. I listed the freelance coding gigs I used to do for pizza money, the weird troubleshooting jobs I did for a mechanic's garage in high school, and the chatbot I built for a local dog shelter that didn't even work half the time but made them think I was some kind of genius. Then I emailed every tech startup in a 50-mile radius offering to consult for free. I didn't care about pay. I just needed access. I needed to see the inside. To touch the machines. I didn't know it yet, but that note I wrote in Joey's, the one that said, "Never again?" That was my mission statement. Not for a company, not even for revenge, but for something quieter and meaner. I was going to make sure they'd never get the chance to exclude me again. Not because I'd force my way in, but because I'd be so far above their reach that they'd choke on their own pride before asking me to come down. And still, I didn't block her. I didn't unfollow. I wanted to watch. I wanted to witness, in real time, how far I'd go while they stood still. Watching, like they always did, but this time from below. If you ask most people, they'll tell you that humiliation fades with time, that it eventually gets replaced by resilience or perspective or whatever platitude they're peddling that day. But I can tell you from experience, that kind of humiliation, the kind that comes not from strangers but from your own blood, the kind that's not screamed but whispered behind your back in warm kitchens and at white tablecloth dinners, that doesn't fade. It mutates, it hardens, and if you let it, it shapes everything that comes after. I didn't grow up thinking I was stupid, but I grew up knowing I wasn't brilliant the way Claire was considered brilliant. She was the born leader, the AP student, the future senator or surgeon or socialite, depending on the year. I was the creative one, which was just code for we don't know what the hell she's doing, but we hope she doesn't end up on a GoFundMe. Every time I tried to start something, whether it was that online vintage shop I launched in college or the tutoring app one tried building with 2 friends who bailed as soon as finals hit, Claire had a way of offering support that sounded more like a eulogy than encouragement. "It's really sweet that you're doing your own thing," she'd say, in that voice she used when she wanted people to know she was being gracious. "I just worry you're spreading yourself too thin, you know? Maybe you should try something more structured." Structured, in Claire's vocabulary, meant respectable. It meant a job where I could wear a blazer and act like I belonged in their orbit, maybe with a predictable title and an automatic 401k and a business card that didn't require an explanation. I didn't want any of that. I wanted to build. I wanted to make things that worked, things that fixed problems, things that didn't need validation to matter. But every time I failed, and believe me, I failed often, Claire and Ben were always right there with their sympathetic head tilts and condescending smiles, acting like they were doing me a favor by treating me like a child with a toy keyboard. So after that night at the diner, after I wrote "never again" into my phone like a promise to myself, I made a list, not of people, not of goals, but of gaps. Places where the world broke down a little. Inefficiencies that people accepted because they didn't know better. I went back to basics, the kind of thinking that doesn't require degrees or capital, but does require obsession. I started watching how people use devices. I hung around hardware stores just to talk to the guys who fixed cash registers and ATMs. I pored over open-source blueprints at night and practiced soldering on old toaster parts during the day. Eventually, I landed a job, if you could call it that, cleaning after hours at a mid-sized robotics lab that rented space in a converted warehouse downtown. It wasn't glamorous. It paid barely enough to keep gas in the tank. But what it gave me was access. The janitorial staff had access cards that led us into all the rooms, including the development bay, which smelled like burned plastic and stale coffee and ambition. I kept my head down for the first few weeks, but I made mental notes, what code they were writing on the whiteboards, which parts of the AI models they seemed frustrated with, where they were failing over and over. It's amazing what you can learn just by being invisible. People talk differently when they assume you're not smart enough to understand them. They don't guard secrets. They don't question your presence. They vent out loud like you're just part of the walls. Then one night, late, maybe past midnight, one of the senior developers, a guy named Matteo who always smelled like he hadn't showered since Tuesday, left his laptop open on the break room table. I knew I shouldn't have touched it, and I wasn't looking to snoop, but curiosity got the better of me. They'd been struggling for weeks with a faulty input mapping system that refused to integrate with their adaptive learning kernel, and I'd been following along silently, reverse engineering their problems in a notebook I never showed anyone. I saw the code. I saw where it broke. And without thinking too hard, I fixed it. I typed in a patch, tested it in sandbox mode, then closed the laptop and returned to my mop. I didn't leave a name. I didn't need to. The next morning, I came in earlier than usual, half expecting to be fired for tampering with the hardware. Instead, Matteo cornered me by the vending machines, eyes wide, holding his laptop like it contained a map to buried treasure. "Did you touch my code?" he asked, but not with anger, more like disbelief. I shrugged. It wasn't compiling because of the loopback conflict between the sensors and the training model, I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was pounding in my throat. "You were feeding it too much too fast. You needed a delay parameter." He just stared. Then, for the first time since I started, he smiled. "You're not just the cleaning crew, are you?" That was the moment. Not glamorous, not dramatic. Just a quiet turning point where someone who mattered looked at me and didn't see a burden or a disappointment or a punchline. He saw utility. And I don't say that with bitterness, I say that with precision. Because sometimes being useful is more powerful than being loved. At least usefulness doesn't vanish when you disappoint people. Within 2 weeks, they offered me a contractor position, nothing official, nothing with benefits, but a desk and a laptop and permission to tinker with live code. I worked during the day, cleaned during the night, slept maybe 4 hours a day, ate when I remembered. But I didn't care. I was in. Not at the top. Not even close. But no longer outside. And that's all I needed. Just a crack in the door. I didn't tell Claire. She still thought I worked at some discount bookstore. She'd sent me a photo the week prior of Ben speaking at some small business forum, captioned, "Making Waves." I didn't respond. Didn't heart it. Didn't even open the message. But I saved the screenshot. Not because I needed to remember it, but because I wanted a record of what people looked like before the world caught up to the truth. And the truth was this. I had no mentors, no MBA, no safety net, no PR team, and no one clapping for me on the sidelines. What I had was humiliation, rage, a notebook full of schematics, and an obsessive desire to make something that worked. Something that mattered. Something they couldn't ignore, even if they tried. And I knew deep down that when the time came, they would try. There is a certain kind of war that doesn't start with declarations or gunfire or dramatic speeches, but rather with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't just linger in the room but wraps itself around your spine and settles into your lungs, making it harder to breathe each day, not because you're suffocating in a physical sense, but because every breath you take feels like a quiet rebellion against the version of yourself the world has already decided you are. That was the kind of war I was in. Not with swords or lawsuits, but with the belief, so deeply held by my family and especially by my sister, that I would always be the one who didn't quite make it, the one who tried hard but never broke through. The one who should have accepted her place a long time ago and stopped trying to build castles out of spare parts and used code. By the time I had transitioned from janitor to contract developer and eventually to the unofficial problem solver at the robotics lab, something in me had shifted so completely that even I didn't recognize myself in the mirror some mornings. Gone was the woman who second-guessed every sentence she spoke at a dinner table or rehearsed answers to questions that no one would bother to ask. I had become a creature of function, of calculation, of necessity, someone who stayed up until dawn mapping circuits, someone who scoured subreddits and back-alley hacker forums for solutions to problems I hadn't even been assigned yet. Someone who understood that the fastest way to outrun condescension wasn't to scream into the void, but to leave a trail of irrefutable results that no one could explain away or ignore. But like all things that evolve in the dark, I was still alone in it. And that kind of loneliness does something to you. It sharpens the edges of your thinking. It makes you strategic in ways that no MBA program ever teaches. It teaches you to play long games with short resources. So while the robotics company eventually shuttered, like many mid-tier startups do, not with scandal, but with a quiet whimper of dried-up funding and laid-off staff, I walked away not defeated, but armed with 2 years of access to proprietary systems, a half-dozen internal contacts, and the beginning of an idea that I knew, in my bones, had the potential to be bigger than anything I'd ever touched. I took my severance, small as it was, and did something my sister would have called reckless. If she ever learned about it, I turned it into seed money for a prototype. No team. No press release. No Instagram announcement with pastel branding and faux inspirational quotes. Just me, alone in my garage, surrounded by cables, coffee cups, and an overwhelming sense that if I didn't do this now, I would spend the rest of my life watching other people succeed with worse ideas and better connections. I spent 4 months living like a ghost, turning down dinner invitations, letting calls go to voicemail, ignoring the bills as long as I could, and investing every ounce of mental energy into building a device that could learn to optimize itself. Not just reactively, but proactively, in a way that mimicked human adaptability without relying on pre-scripted logic paths. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have a sleek design or a catchy name or a marketing plan. But it worked. And in the right hands, I knew it could change the way autonomous systems functioned across multiple industries, from healthcare to logistics to goddamn vending machines. What I needed now wasn't approval. It was funding. And for that, I needed someone who could see beyond my resume and into the tech itself. Enter Amir Patel, a private investor I found through a second-tier pitch competition I didn't even win, but where I managed to corner him afterward near the snack table and convince him to look at my demo in the parking lot, using a portable setup I'd wired into the trunk of my Honda Civic. He said no at first. Then he watched it in action. Then he said maybe. 2 weeks later, he transferred $50,000 into a new business account I'd set up that morning. No promises, he said. Just potential. That was all I needed. I formed the LLC, filed the patent, hired 2 people off Craigslist who understood hardware better than I ever would, and set up shop in the back room of a closed-down tanning salon that still smelled like desperation and coconut oil. I called the company Stanton Systems not after a person, but after a street I used to walk when I needed to clear my head. Something about the word felt grounded, unpretentious, like the opposite of Claire and Ben's curated little world. We didn't look like a startup. We didn't act like one. We just built. Day in, day out. Nothing performative. Nothing polished. Just output. Meanwhile, Claire still believed I worked retail. She had sent me a text that month asking if I'd be willing to donate to Ben's city council campaign, which was apparently picking up steam, although I suspected that meant someone with a hyphenated last name had liked one of his posts. I didn't answer. Not out of spite, but because I knew she wasn't actually asking. She was just checking a box. That's how Claire worked. Everything transactional, everything part of a long game. She didn't even realize she was playing against herself. But I didn't delete the text. I saved it. Like I had saved every voicemail, every message, every unsolicited advice email she had ever sent me in the years when she still believed I needed her. I saved them not because they hurt, but because they reminded me of where I'd started. Then, one morning, as I was reviewing code updates with my team, now up to 6 people, most of them contractors with unusual resumes and relentless work ethics, I received an email that I had to read 3 times before it registered. The subject line was simple: Female Founders Disrupting AI, Bloomber segment. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't spam. It was real. They'd heard about Stanton Systems through a supply chain blog, traced our prototype through a defense contract evaluation, and wanted to feature us as part of a new segment highlighting companies flying under the radar with outsized impact. I didn't scream. I didn't jump. I didn't tell anyone. I just stared at the email until the screen dimmed. Because for the first time, I realized the war I'd been waging wasn't quiet anymore. It was about to go public. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Claire was about to find out. Not because I'd tell her, but because the world would. There is a peculiar kind of poetry in watching the very people who once smirked at your ambition unknowingly celebrate their irrelevance, and if I sound cruel in admitting that, then so be it. Because there are few things in this life more clarifying than betrayal followed by silence, especially when the betrayal was dressed in pearls and presented with a smile, and the silence was not an absence of words, but a calculated refusal to acknowledge your growth until it became impossible to ignore. On the night of the gala, the same gala I had once been deemed too embarrassing to attend, the one my sister had preened for with relentless rehearsals of small talk and sponsor names, I didn't need to pretend anymore that I was unaware of how little they thought of me. In fact, I counted on it. The day had started as most others had in the past few months, with back-to-back meetings in our cramped office, which still smelled faintly of tanning lotion despite our best efforts to bleach its history from the walls, and as I moved between calls with advisors, hardware revisions, and a contract negotiation that was threatening to fall apart over licensing clauses, I realized, almost absently, that I'd completely forgotten the date of the event. It wasn't until I saw Claire's latest Instagram post, a heavily filtered photo of a pre-gala lunch with the caption, "Nothing like giving back with style," that I remembered what the evening was supposed to represent, a celebration of charitable egos, curated conversations, and socially strategic networking that had nothing to do with actual impact and everything to do with optics. I didn't reply to her post. I didn't like it. I didn't send her a passive-aggressive text or make a snide remark to a friend. Instead, I finished the negotiation, finalized a new batch of circuit schematics for overnight production, and took the long way home, stopping by a Korean grocery store where no one knew my name and no one cared what I looked like, to pick up a microwavable bibimbap and a bottle of plum wine. I ate in silence at my kitchen counter while my laptop streamed the live stream of the fundraiser, which, in its opening monologue, thanked local leaders and family legacies for their continued investment in the community's future. Claire appeared briefly on the screen, standing next to Ben, both of them draped in fabrics that probably cost more than my month's payroll, smiling in that frozen way people do when they've rehearsed their expressions to match the occasion. I didn't feel bitterness, not exactly. What I felt was a kind of detached curiosity, the same sensation one experiences when flipping through a yearbook and seeing faces you once thought defined your world but now strike you as mere placeholders in someone else's narrative. I watched them laugh, toast champagne, pose for the local paper, and somewhere in the middle of all that performative excellence, my phone buzzed, not with a text from Claire, not with an apology or an invitation or even a half-hearted, "Wish you were here," but with a notification from Bloomberg's official YouTube channel. The segment had dropped. The one they filmed 2 weeks ago, the one they had pitched as quiet innovation from unexpected places, the one I had recorded in a neutral-toned blazer with sweaty palms and a voice that shook for the first 3 takes before finally settling into something firm and undeniable. I clicked play, not because I hadn't seen the final cut, but because I wanted to watch it exactly as Claire would, accidentally, mid-scroll, while basking in her own relevance, only to be gut-punched by mine. The piece was simple, direct, respectful in tone, and almost irritatingly factual. They called Stanton systems a disruptive force in scalable adaptive logic, and me, a founder whose unconventional path defied expectation and redefined what technical leadership can look like. There was a brief clip of our demo, a shot of my team working in the converted salon, and an ending quote that I still don't remember giving. Sometimes it takes a little invisibility to make something that truly matters. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just watched. Then, almost exactly 10 minutes later, the first voicemail came in, my phone buzzing on the countertop like an alarm I hadn't set. It was from Claire. She didn't say anything of substance at first, just that she had seen the video, that it was so great, and that we should talk soon. The tone was clipped, unfamiliar, and there was a pause before she hung up, the kind of pause you only hear from people who are deciding, mid-sentence, how much groveling is beneath them. I didn't respond. I didn't even press play on the message. I just let it sit there, glowing on the screen like a warning. Then came Ben's. Then my mother's. Then my father's, who hadn't called me in 6 months, but suddenly remembered how to say my name. One after the other, like dominoes falling in reverse, as if some great alarm had gone off in their heads, and they were scrambling to rewrite the script before I read it aloud. One message even said, "It would be good to loop you into some of what we're doing, now that you're kind of a big deal," as if my name was suddenly currency they could borrow against. I didn't call anyone back. I didn't block them either. Instead, I opened my screenshots folder, the one I'd been slowly filling over the years with every dismissive text, every thinly veiled insult, every suggestion that I find a real job or stop trying so hard to make it work. And then I took screenshots of every voicemail notification. I didn't need the audio. I just wanted the receipts. Because revenge, in the world I now lived in, wasn't about slamming doors or shouting matches. It was about keeping quiet long enough to let the silence tell the story. That night, while Claire and Ben stood in a ballroom clinking glasses and reaping applause from people who didn't know the truth, I sat alone in my apartment wearing an old hoodie, eating cold rice, and feeling, for the first time in years, completely and utterly full. Not with food, not with pride, but with proof. Proof that I didn't have to push my way into rooms anymore. Because now, whether they admitted it or not, they were the ones on the outside looking in. And they had no idea how far inside I already was. There's a strange sort of stillness that settles in after a personal war ends, not a celebratory stillness, not the kind filled with applause or confetti or champagne toasts, but the kind that feels like standing alone in an empty field long after the last shot's been fired, with nothing left but the echo of what was said and what wasn't, and the unsettling realization that, even in victory, you are now someone you weren't before. Someone less interested in being understood than in being unbothered, someone who no longer flinches when the phone rings, but also no longer answers. That morning, the one after the Gala and the Bloomber segment, I awoke not to silence, but to 27 voicemails, each one a small, desperate attempt to rewrite a history that had already been published. Each one coming from a voice that used to speak to me in condescension or choreographed concern, now recalibrated into apology, curiosity, or something that tried very hard to resemble affection but cracked under the weight of timing. I didn't listen to them at first. I just stared at the pile of notifications on my screen, watched the names scroll past Claire, Ben, Mom, Dad, even Aunt Louise, who had once pulled me aside at Thanksgiving to tell me that some girls just aren't meant for big things, and that's okay. And I sat there, in bed, coffee cooling on the windowsill, wrapped in a blanket of disbelief so thick it felt like armor. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering how to make them proud or even how to make them see me. I was wondering how I had ever given their words so much power in the first place. The first voicemail I opened wasn't Claire's. It was my father's. He had that same tone he used when trying to be both stern and supportive, a tone I'd learned to decode as "I don't really understand what you're doing, but now that someone else has validated it, I guess it matters." He said he'd seen the Bloomberg piece, that he was proud, that maybe I could come over and explain that tech thing to him over dinner. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was astonishing how quickly people who once dismissed you as a failure begin to recast themselves as lifelong believers the second the tide changes. I closed the message. No response. No reaction. Just another screenshot. Claire's messages were next. Multiple, layered with escalating tones of sincerity, as if she were running a focus group on emotional accessibility and couldn't decide whether to lead with cheerfulness, regret, or deflection. The first was light, congratulatory, casual, as if we'd spoken last week. The second was a bit more serious. "I had no idea you were doing so much with that company of yours. Really impressive stuff." And then the third, sent at nearly 2 a.m, slightly panicked, her voice tight. "We should really talk. I know things haven't always been perfect between us, but I didn't mean to make you feel left out. I hope you know that." That one I saved twice. Not for revenge, but for memory. Because sometimes, hearing someone finally stumble over the weight of their own denial is worth preserving. Then came Ben's voice. Stiff. Scripted. A man clearly instructed to call by a woman who had begun to sense her narrative slipping from her hands. He talked about opportunities, how we could maybe collaborate on something, how it'd be a win-win, really. It wasn't even insulting, it was pathetic. I didn't feel anger toward him. I felt a kind of academic fascination, like watching a man try to bail out a sinking ship using a paper cup and a motivational speech. Another screenshot. I kept them all. Not because I intended to release them or play them back in public or build some dramatic exposé, but because they were proof of something far more valuable than guilt or regret. They were evidence of change. Not theirs. Mine. They showed me how far I'd traveled. Not just geographically or professionally, but emotionally, psychologically, from a place of smallness and shame to a place where I no longer needed anything from them, not even an apology. That night, I went to the IPO celebration alone. I was offered a dozen plus ones, but I turned them all down, not to make a statement, but because I didn't feel like performing gratitude for people who hadn't been there for the parts of the journey that nearly broke me. I wore the red dress. The one Claire had once called cheap-looking at a family barbecue when I'd worn it for no one but myself. I wore it without irony, without revenge, just with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no matter how they saw me now, they could never again decide how I saw myself. The venue wasn't grand. No chandeliers. No velvet curtains. Just an industrial loft in the middle of the city with high ceilings, exposed beams, and the raw energy of people who had built something from nothing. My team was there, tired, scrappy, brilliant people who had believed in the product, in the work, in me, long before the word IPO ever meant anything to any of us. I gave a short speech. Nothing rehearsed. I simply said, "This isn't for the people who cheered when we succeeded. This is for the ones who stood by us when we were failing, when we weren't even sure what we were building yet. And it's for the people who were told they weren't enough. You are. Keep going." After the applause, after the handshakes and hugs and the champagne in plastic cups, I stepped outside, onto the fire escape, and stood alone for a moment under the city sky, the air thick with traffic noise and the scent of hot pavement and possibility. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Claire. Just 3 words, "Can we talk?" I didn't answer. Not because I hated her. I didn't. Not because I wanted to punish her. I didn't. But because I had realized something deeply, irrevocably true. Some conversations are only necessary when you still believe the other person has something you need. And I no longer did. I never deleted the voicemails. But I never replied either. And that, more than the segment, more than the funding, more than the IPO, that was the real victory. The moment I chose not to return to the table I was once denied a seat at. Not out of spite, but because I had built my own. And it was full.